So welcome to the first session, the regular session of Code PaLOUsa 2020. I appreciate you being here. Thanks for joining us. I'm John Morehouse, and this is data migration to Azure SQL Platform made easy. My contact information is right there. The email address is up on the screen. You are welcome to email me questions about the presentation, or if you're having SQL Server related problems, feel free to drop me a line. I like to help. I like to help solve problems. So if you're stuck at work on a problem with your SQL servers, or you want guidance or direction, feel free to drop me a line. And if I don't know the answer, I could probably point you in the right, at least in the right direction. So we'll go ahead and get started. A little bit more about me. I have additional contact information there on the screen. Feel free. I'm usually on Twitter. I don't do Facebook or pretty much any other social media. Twitter is the place to find me. That is, I do have to quantify. That's SQL R Us, not SQL Russ. I do blog at SQLRUs.com. So think Toys R Us, everything toys, everything SQL Server. I touch just about every facet, but the only thing I don't do is data intelligence. Don't ask me to build a report. Don't ask me to do Power BI. If you want me to support the infrastructure underneath those, I certainly can, but don't ask me to build reports. I can't make it look pretty. I'm also known on Twitter as DBA with the Bat. I speak quite frequently, probably once a month at least. I blog, I tweet. About blogs. I do blog about the internals of SQL Server. So I'm that weird DBA that likes to reverse engineer hexadecimal at 10:30 on a Saturday night because I don't have a social life. So I'm that guy. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. I do help the local SQL Server user group here in town in Louisville to run and make meetings and share content. And I also help organize the local SQL Saturday. For those that might not know what a SQL Saturday is, we actually have a full day of free training. The only cost to the attendees is lunch, which is usually $15 or less. But we bring in speakers for a full day's worth of content, whether it's SQL Server database administration or development or Power BI or business intelligence. We usually have a wide range of sessions. This year, obviously, we actually had to postpone it due to COVID, but SQL Saturdays is a great way to get free training on Microsoft products, SQL Server. We also allow really any database data related products. So we have Snowflake, we've got Amazon, Google comes in every now and then. So if you ever want to know, go to SQLSaturday.com. You can find one in your local area. A little bit more about who I work for. I work for a company called Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. We are a consulting shop, but we like to help the community. So again, if you have issues with SQL Server at work or questions about this presentation, drop me a line. I'd be happy to help. If you're looking for a consultant to help you with your SQL Server environment, feel free to drop me a line. No sweat, no big deal. Events like this and your local events, user groups run off of sponsors. So thankfully, we have some really awesome sponsors for Code PaLOUsa this year. So if you can reach out and say thanks to these folks, attend their sessions, do whatever. It takes person hours and money to put these things on. So thank you very much to the sponsors that helped us get here today. So let's talk about the agenda. We're going to talk about some challenges. We're going to talk about some questions to ask to help kind of overcome some of those challenges. And then we're going to talk about some of the tools and methodologies that we have available to migrate SQL from a on-premises infrastructure onto Microsoft Azure SQL. There's a couple of different ways that we can migrate that data from on-premises up to the cloud. And then we'll talk about some tools. So there's a couple of different tools that are available to help facilitate this. Some are free, some are paid. So you can actually pay a service to help migrate your data depending on your volume and your needs and your requirements. And I've actually got a couple of demos. We'll actually use one of the tools to do an assessment of a local database I have on my laptop, and then we'll actually use that same tool to actually migrate that database up from my laptop to Microsoft Azure. And then we'll do some questions and answers. As I said before, I like tangents, I like questions. Feel free to chat at me in the chat, and I'll do my best to see them and find answers for you. So, all right, so let's talk about challenges. And sometimes migrating SQL Server data in general comes with its own challenges. And as data professionals, whatever role you are in your organization, we have to overcome these challenges before we can move to Azure. I see a lot of, hey, there's Dave. Hey, Dave. I see a lot of organizations that want to go to the cloud, whether it's Microsoft or Google, and they just want to go. Like they don't stop and slow down to think about, let's answer some certain questions. Let's find out all the answers what we need. They just want to go. They want to get to the cloud. The cloud's going to solve all their problems. All the performance problems are going to go away. And that's just not the case. I've actually seen migrations to the cloud where the performance and the reliability actually got worse. Not because of the infrastructure of the cloud, but because of the infrastructure and the methodologies that they use to get to the cloud. It was all messed up. So in organizations, do you know where all your data is? You'd be surprised at how many times I've gone into organizations that want to go to the cloud, and we start to ask about, do you know where your data is? And they say, well, sure, we know where it's at. It's right over here in this database. Yes, turns out that's only one piece of it. There's actually 15 other Excel files spread across 14 different web servers that is part of that data that has to be included in the project. Many organizations don't have a good idea, especially the larger organizations. As soon as you get server sprawl and extreme growth, and now you've got 1,000 employees, data is literally sprinkled everywhere. So one of the questions you have to ask before you migrate is, do you know where all your data is? If you don't, you need to go find it. And I would recommend that you document it. Put it in a OneNote, put it in OneDrive, put it somewhere and document where that data is living. Do you know how big your data is? This is also one of those misconceptions that I go into organizations and they say, oh yeah, it's only 10 gigs, which we can migrate 10 gigs relatively easily. No, it turns out it's multi-terabyte. That's a big difference. In migrating 10 gigs versus multi-terabytes or even petabytes of data changes the ballgame drastically. So if we don't have a good idea as to how much data we actually have to migrate, then we have a problem. So knowing how big your data is super important. Do you have any organizational constraints? Do you have any special security requirements or networking requirements or data requirements? Do you have any requirements that it has to be online? You can't stage the data. Any organizational constraints from like HIPAA or SOX or anything like that? If we don't answer those questions, we can't ensure that the target destination, whatever product we're going to, can facilitate those needs. And then once we get there, you could be in a world of hurt. So make sure that you understand any organizational constraints they might have. If you don't know, go ask. Go find your security teams, go ask your networking teams, go ask whoever, ask everybody in the sun. Do we have any constraints that we need to know about so we can adjust if necessary? Do you know where the data is going? This seems really like this should be a known answer, but you might be surprised as some people in the organization, we're talking about a migration project and they really don't know where the data is going. They know it's going to the cloud. It's 2020 and I still have conversations with people that think that the cloud is this nebulous ether that when we put data in the cloud, it's just kind of sprinkled throughout, the ether. And when you need the data, it just magically gets reconstituted back down to your local laptop or your local servers and everything is groovy. That's not really the case. Really the cloud is just somebody else's computer. We're just borrowing it for a while. So where the data is going makes a difference. It also is interesting to know where that data is going in terms of, is it going all the way across the country? Is it going across the world? Where in terms of a region, where is that going? Is your internet connection stable enough? I actually have a client today who has, they actually have 2 connections to the internet from their organization, and they're in a region where their business connection is somewhat flaky. And so it'll actually drop. I actually use their internet connection to push files from their local office up to Azure, actually, database backups. And so I push that to blob storage, but their internet connection drops. And it's not necessarily drops for hours and hours, but it will disconnect. And so that can sometimes cause my process issues because it disconnects. It can't talk to Azure. So do you have a solid enough connection to get to the cloud, and so that you can do your migration in a way that is ensured to be successful all the way through. Especially if you're moving larger amounts of data. If you're moving terabytes of data, you don't want to move most of it and then have the connection drop, and that causes you issues. Okay. So is your internet connection stable enough is a great question. If that's not your department, go find out who it is. Go ask your networking team, do we have everything cool? Have we done testing? All that stuff. Do you need to worry about permissions? This should absolutely be yes. As data professionals or whatever your job role is, understanding permissions should be important. So yes, this should be an emphatically yes. We should need to worry about permissions. This is just something that we need to understand and know that yes, we need to double check permissions when we get there. But yes, we should worry about permissions. Is data encryption important? See my first answer. Yes, data encryption is important. I don't know how many times we see on the news that some cloud provider, there's a breach because somebody left a blob storage or a bucket unsecured, and there's important data in there, and now it's been breached, and now we all have to go through the rigmarole of figuring out if our information is in there. Data encryption should absolutely be important. It should absolutely be the forefront of the migration process to ensure that your data, that your customer's data, is as secure as possible when moving from on-premises up to a cloud provider. Okay. Can you handle an outage? So this kind of is tied back to your internet connectivity. But if your company, if your data center loses power, how do we handle that from a migration standpoint? Do we have to restart? Can we resume? Where in the migration process did it die? And then how do we handle that? But can we handle that outage? So some questions to ask. Now, choosing the right method and getting up to Azure is kind of like picking the right donut. And I'll be honest, there is no wrong answer here, because the right donut is a donut. There's just nothing about it. Yes, all of them. Megan says all of them. So all of them is my answer as well, because there is no wrong donut in my opinion. But there are a bunch of methods that we can use to get to Microsoft Azure or any cloud provider, especially around SQL. The other thing I want you to think about, and I kind of mentioned this, is that physics will always win. You can't beat the speed of light. So when we talk about methodologies and migrating data to Azure, we want to think about where our data is sitting currently and where in the region is it going. I kind of mentioned that earlier, but keep in mind that physics will always win. You can't beat the speed of light. And so if you're moving multi-terabyte from Louisville, Kentucky to Seattle, Washington, that data has to physically travel from Louisville, Kentucky to Seattle, Washington, and that takes time. So we have to understand and realize that physics always wins. Now, you can kind of bend that a little bit if you have a big checkbook, right? You can use what's called an express route, which is a faster direct connection to Microsoft Azure. It's expensive, but you could deploy faster means or a bigger pipe to help overcome some of this. But at the end of the game, physics will always win. So let's talk about some methods. So, and this is specifically going from a local SQL Server environment to Microsoft SQL Azure. So this is not going to be about moving to any other database platforms or anything like that. So one of the things that you can do is what's called a DAC pack or a backpack. So you can actually go to your local database, right click and say export. The DAC pack is just the schema of the database. The backpack is the schema and the data. This is not an online operation. It's a one and you export it, you save the file, and then you upload that XML file to Microsoft Azure. You can import it. You can do a couple different things. This would work for SQL Server on an Azure VM. This would work for Azure SQL Database or a managed instance, but it's not very flexible or forgiving. So that is an option. One of my favorite options is a backup and restore. Now, if you're running SQL Server on an Azure VM, this works great. You can back up your local database, push it up to SQL Server on Azure virtual machine, and then restore that file, and change your networking around, and you're up and running. This is also not what I would consider online, meaning you have to take a point in time, restore it, back it up, move it, restore it, and you're good. Any transactions that change between the time when you backed it up and then pushed it and restored it, you'd have to do that operation again to get those new transactions. This doesn't work for Azure SQL Database, because Azure SQL Database, we don't have access to the underlying infrastructure. It is platform as a service. We only have access to the database itself, but it would work for managed instance. So if you're going to a managed instance product, we can use this, but we have to restore it from an Azure Blob storage. So we have to set up a little bit different process, but backup and restore from a database perspective is probably one of the biggest tried and true methodologies for migration. So depending on what your requirements are, this might be a good solution for you. And then SQL Server has a product or a method called log shipping. And what this entails really is we actually, in the way that SQL Server works, is that there's a data file and a log file. And the log file is what maintains transactional consistency when you make data modifications. So we can actually take that log file, take a backup of it, which is usually pretty small, and then we actually ship or send that backup to another SQL server, and then that SQL server will restore that log file, and then keep that other SQL server will be kept up to date for the most part with the original SQL server that we made the data modifications on. This is also a tried and true methodology for SQL Server. It is easy to set up. It works. This would work for SQL Server on a SQL Azure virtual machine, but it won't work for Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance, unfortunately. But if you're going to another virtual machine, I really like log shipping. It is easy to set up, like I said, easy to manage. If it breaks for some reason, it's easy to restart. So that's a good option. Transactional replication. So if you're going to SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine or Azure SQL Database, you can use transactional replication. It's easy to set up, and this is actually one of the demos I have. I will actually set up transactional replication from my local laptop to an Azure SQL Database in the cloud, and we can actually see that process work and how relatively easy it is. And so in transactional replication will allow us to actually online migrate the database. So as changes happen to my original source, as changes happen, those changes are automatically replicated to the destination in the cloud, which is handy, right? So if I'm migrating a small subset of databases, I can set up transactional replication to Azure SQL Database. And as those changes happen, they get automatically pushed to my new destination. And then the day of migration, I just cut that cord, and the new database is pretty much in sync at that point in time. And we do some networking changes, and voila, we've migrated. This doesn't necessarily work on scale. Depends on your requirements, depends on your infrastructure, but it's a great way to do it. It's really easy to set up. Another option we have is called availability groups. And availability groups is a way on SQL Server that we can in a sense, it's kind of like transactional replication, where as changes happen in the source, those changes are automatically propagated to where I'm migrating to. So, Microsoft Azure. This requires SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. So you have to go from your local on-premise SQL Server up to another virtual machine. It is more complicated to set up. It's a little bit more robust, right? So it's a little bit more forgiving when you have networking issues and other things. And it also provides disaster recovery and potentially high availability of your SQL servers. But from a migration standpoint, this is also one of those tried and true methodologies, because it keeps your target database in sync with your primary as you go through the migration. And it allows you to, one of the things I'll talk about is it allows me to stage the bulk of the migration. I'm all for making my life easier. I don't want to work harder. I want to work smarter. So if I can do a migration where I can get 98, 99% of the data up into the cloud before the day of the migration, and then I only have to worry about that 1% or a very small subset of data, that makes my job easier. And so I can pre-stage a lot of this before actually moving to Microsoft Azure. So that's some of the native things with SQL Server that we can use. And my clicker just died. That is. Oh, now it's working. That's really weird. Okay. So here are some other methodologies. There is a tool called Data Migration Assistant. So this is a free tool that Microsoft offers. You can go out and download it. It's got a decent UI. And so you can actually do two things with this Data Migration Assistant. You can perform an assessment of your local database, and you can use this tool to actually push the database, the schema, and the data up to your cloud resource. And so you can actually specify, and you can use this tool for all the Microsoft Azure products. So you can say, hey, I want to go from a local instance up to managed instance or SQL DB, SQL database, or SQL Server on Azure virtual machine. It'll do all that. The assessment piece will actually check your local database to see if there's any coding constructs that won't work in whatever product you're going to in Azure. It'll also check for any it'll actually alert on your local instance that you've got feature parity, meaning that you're using a feature of SQL Server on your local environment that doesn't work for Azure as well. So it kind of does a couple different checks and will alert you, hey, you need to go fix this before you actually move to Azure. Another one is Azure Database Migration Services. And these are just like everything else in Microsoft. There are acronyms. So Data Migration Assistant is commonly known as DMA, and then Azure Database Migration Services is commonly known as DMS. Azure Database Migration Services actually utilizes Data Migration Assistant behind the scenes. So you actually stand up a Azure resource for database migration and services, and then actually will install a small agent that will talk to Data Migration Assistant and then do the migration for you. There is a free tier, and then there's a premium and or paid tier. The paid tier, you get higher throughput, you get a couple different things, and we'll talk about it a little bit more here a little bit. But that is available to you. You also have Azure Data Box, and this is also a paid service. If you are migrating tons of data, and I mean multi-terabytes, one of the things that Microsoft offers is a service where they will actually ship you hardware. You copy all your data onto the hardware, and then you ship the hardware back to Microsoft. They take that hardware and they plug it physically into their network, and they upload the data to your Azure resources. Now, that makes the migration could be faster, could be slower, depending on how much data you're moving and all that stuff. But you have to, take into account, you have to ship that information back and forth. The drives are secured, it's all encrypted, strongest encryption that's available. And there's multiple tiers, but it is a paid service, and I have more information on a future slide here. Another option that we have, and I just mentioned this lightly, is SQL Server Integration Services, or SSIS. You can use this to develop what are called packages to move your data from point A to point B. I don't see this being utilized a lot. I see more of the Data Migration Assistant or the migration services or the traditional backup and restore or availability groups or transactional replication. The integration services piece is probably lower on my list, in part because you have to have the knowledge and know how to develop those packages and how they function. So integration services is not, I wanted to mention it at least. It is an option, and I think it can talk to all three products. Managed instance is the only one that I'm not sure of. It should, but that's the only one I'm not sure of. But it is an option. So, and my clicker's not working again. Technical difficulties. Oh, here we go. So we talked about some methods. We talked about some options. And so what I've done is I've put together this matrix of options. I actually tried to put I wanted to put like a really cool matrix look and feel to it. The movie, it just didn't work out that way. So we can see here that there are some options here. So when we ask those questions, one of the questions that we should ask, with a method, when we start evaluating those methods, can I scale it? How many databases do we have to move? If I have to move 10, that's a whole different ballgame than if I have to move thousands. And I've seen organizations that they want to move thousands of databases up to Microsoft Azure. I've seen organizations. We actually have a client that we migrated 40 or 50 terabytes worth of data out of their co-location data center that they were using up to Microsoft Azure. Now, thankfully, they had a really large internet connectivity to Microsoft Azure. They had an express route, so we could actually move that data relatively quickly. I think it took a weekend, but we could do it. So is it scalable? Can I scale it up to multiple databases as well as data size? You know, if I can't scale that to facilitate that, then that kind of helps me drive to the right method that suits my requirements. So we can see which ones are online, which ones will handle permissions. Furthermore, can I stage the data? As I said before, I want to make my life easier. So staging the data is really important to me as a data professional. I will almost always stage the data as much as possible, because then my job during migration is a lot less. Okay. Same thing with the other services that we asked. Database migration services is scalable, whereas data migration assistant is not. So if you look at those two tools, data migration assistant, while you can select multiple databases on an instance, you can't scale that easily across multiple instances. But so if you're going to scale that, then use the database migration services. So let's talk about migration services real quick. So standard is offline only, meaning that it's not going to do an online migration with the database when you move it. It is free, as I mentioned, for the standard tier, and basically what they do is they stand up a virtual machine, if you will, and that service has a number of cores. The more cores you have, the faster it can do that migration potentially. You have a choice of 1, 2, or 4, and I need a space before that too. So you can choose a couple different levels of performance. Premium, as I said, supports online and offline. You do pay for it, and you get faster migration speeds. So you have to evaluate the cost of that premium versus the standard, as well as your requirements to migrate. Again, I've seen organizations that they want to get to the cloud as quickly as possible, but they don't want to pay for it. So you kind of have to choose the best evil to get to your destination. So you can get premium in 4 cores. That's the only thing you can do. And it's basically 37 cents per hour. Keep in mind, quick disclaimer, Microsoft changes things pretty quickly and frequently. So that pricing might change. So if you come back in 6 months and say, hey, John, that price has changed. Yep, it could change tomorrow. But right now, as of today, when I checked earlier this week, it was still 37 cents per hour. However long it takes, if you're going to move multi-terabytes and it's going to take 48 hours, you can kind of get an idea as to the price that service might charge you. It also varies in price from region to region. If you're moving data out of the East US if you're moving data out of Louisville, Kentucky into the East US region, which is in the Eastern Seaboard, then that might be cheaper than moving data from Louisville, Kentucky to West US, which is on the Western Seaboard. You can kind of see where the prices might be different on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast. So again, check your region, wherever region you're going to and from, your prices might vary a little bit. So the other service we talked about was Azure Data Box. Again, this is an offline migration where connectivity is limited or non-existent. So if you work in a remote area of the country or the world, they will ship you this hardware. You will plug it in. It is an offline migration, obviously, because there's no internet on the UPS truck. So it is offline. They have a data box disk where they'll actually send you up to 5 8-terabyte disks, getting you 40 terabytes in total. And so you can use those 5 8-terabyte disks to move up to 40 terabytes. If that's not enough, they send you a bigger box that will contain disks enough to handle 1 terabyte. And then if that's not big enough, they actually can send you basically a small refrigerator with up to 1 petabyte worth of disks to move that data. It is literally a heavy box. Those hard drives take up or have weight to them. So, you do pay for the shipping cost. So obviously the data box disk, which is smaller, is going to be cheaper in freight than the data box heavy. So you get to pay for the shipping costs, not only from Microsoft to you, but then you to Microsoft. And so if you're shipping that really data box heavy, across the United States, that price could be very well different. So pricing varies depending on where you're shipping things to and the shipping costs of the provider. So I don't have a lot of clients that do this. We did look at a client that was actually located in a part of Canada that their internet connectivity wasn't the best or whatnot. And we actually talked about using this service to help migrate their data because we actually thought this would be faster than migrating it through their internet connectivity. So we actually looked at this product. It turns out they went a different direction, so we didn't deploy it, but this option is available to you. So what are my picks? If I'm going from a local SQL server on a virtual machine to Azure virtual machine, or even SQL server on bare metal in my data center, I like log shipping. Log shipping, like I said, is easy to set up. It's easy to control. It allows me to stage the data. It allows me to keep things relatively in sync within reason, usually 10 to 15 minutes, which is I'm okay with. If I'm going from a SQL database to Azure SQL database, I like Data Migration Assistant. It's a tool that at least will allow me to do an assessment as well as perform the migration from my local database up to Microsoft. And so I tend to use that tool. And again, depends on your requirements, but I usually start there. And if that tool doesn't fit, then I move on to something else. If I'm moving multiple databases, then I'm going to look at the database migration services. Because that's scalable, I can move multiple databases at a better rate than I can with Data Migration Assistant and or other means. If I'm going to managed instance, I like the backup and restore method. This allows me to, again, it's a tried and true method, and then I will back up to a blob storage in Azure. So basically I just take a backup file and put it up into the cloud, and then that managed instance can restore from that blob storage. So that's usually what I use when I go to managed instance, or at least talk to clients about going to managed instance. Okay. All right, we talked about a whole bunch of stuff. So now I'm going to show you some of the tools. Before I do that, any questions? I'm going to take a drink of my coffee. All right, I don't think I have any questions. I'm going to switch screens, and hopefully this works. You're seeing that screen, okay. Okay. Okay, so you should see Data Migration Assistant. It looks like you do. Okay, cool. None yet. Awesome. All right, so this is that free tool that I mentioned, Data Migration Assistant. This is the tool that'll do the assessment as well as the migration. And so what I've got here is I'm running SQL Server 2019 Developer on my local laptop. So it's sitting in my home office in Louisville, Kentucky. I have an Azure SQL database sitting in the East US region. So I'm going from East US to basically East US. And I did that specifically so that my latency between the Azure resource and my laptop is as close together as possible. We have to think about those regions and moving that data back and forth. I could probably talk about regions and all that for like an hour by itself. But the way this works is, and can you see the screen, or do I need to zoom in? A little small. Okay, cool. All right, let's see if I can zoom in. That probably helps. Okay, so the way this works is that you have to create a project. And so I'm going to we're going to do an assessment first, and then we'll do a migration. And so I'm going to give it a project name of just Code PaLOUsa demo. The assessment type is in the assessment type, we'll do two types of assessments. I can assess the database, or I can actually assess integration services packages. I don't have any on my local laptop. That's not what I do. So we're going to use the assessment type of database engine. My source can be SQL Server, or it can actually be RDS in Amazon. Oh, cool. Double click the screen if you want to see it, and it'll make it better. That helps. But I can zoom in too. And my target is going to be a Azure SQL database. My target can be, let's see if I can, so we can see here that I can use this tool to go to Azure SQL database, managed instance. or an Azure virtual machine, or even I can actually use this to migrate data from SQL Server to SQL Server within my local on-premises data center. So even you can even use this tool, even if you're not going to the cloud and you're just moving to a new data center, as long as you can get connectivity to it, you can actually use this tool to do that assessment to make sure everything's kosher. So in this case, it's all cool. And so now I've created the project. We can see that the report type is, it's going to check a couple of things. Like, as I mentioned, it's going to check the feature parity and then the database compatibility, making sure that you don't have something strange in your database structure, code that might not work if you're using in memory or file stream, or you're doing something else that's kind of an edge case scenario. It'll check those things and make sure that everything's cool. We're going to click next. And this is my local laptop. So here I'm going to choose, you can see I've actually got a data migration demo logical server stood up in Azure. So that'll be my destination, but for my source, will be my local laptop. Windows authentication will be just fine. We're going to connect. And then here we've got our list of laptops. We have a list of our databases that we can choose from. Now I'm going to use, if you're an Office fan, the show, Dunder Mifflin, the paper company. A friend of mine in the SQL Server community actually built a data set around the Dunder Mifflin company. And so I actually have fake data that is tied to that show. And it works really well for my demo purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the Dunder Mifflin, and I'm going to add it to my project. And so now we can see that it is added into the project. And then it's going to, the assessment doesn't need to know exactly where it's going. It just knows that it's going to SQL database. And so now it's actually going to be checking. You can't see the process when I'm zoomed in. And then here we can see it came back. So we can see that on the right-hand side, we've got some jobs. These are actually jobs because I can't migrate jobs. This is part of the feature parity. I can't migrate jobs from a full-blown SQL instance into Azure SQL database. So it recognizes that the product I'm going to won't support that. So hey, FYI, if you need that job, you have to go figure out a way to make that work with Azure SQL database. But if we come up here to the radio button and click compatibility issues, we can see that we don't have any compatibility issues. Yeah, so the only thing it checked was I'm using Windows authentication on my local laptop. I can't use Windows authentication in the traditional sense with Azure SQL database. So that's the only thing it caught, was I logged in with a Windows authentication. But we can see, oops, there are no deprecated features. I don't have any other issues. So I should be able to migrate this database without any problems. So let's go ahead and do that migration. And you can also save these assessments so you can do stuff with them and come back to them. You can restart it, you can delete it, you can save it. If you're using the database migration services from Azure, you can actually upload this to that service and store it in Azure. We're not going to do anything here, so I'm actually just going to delete the assessment. And then I'm going to go start a new project. And this time I'm actually going to do a migration project. So same thing, Code PaLOUsa demo migration. In my little slightly different, I can specify a migration scope. I can move just the schema, or I can move just the data, or move both. Now, one of the tricks with the migration is that the database shell has to be in Azure. It can be completely empty, but the database shell has to be there first. So if it's not there, then we need to create the shell, and then we can come back and do the migration. Now, I've already pre-staged this for time. So we will just go ahead and do a schema and data. We're going to create the project. I'm going to select my local laptop. I'm going to click connect, and we see a list of databases that looks very similar to the assessment that we had done. My Dunder Mifflin. I'm going to click next. Now my server name, this is where I'm going to pick. I've already created a data migration demo logical server in Azure, as I mentioned. So that's the server I'm going to pick. And here I've already stood up I'm using SQL Server authentication in part because I didn't want to configure Azure Active Directory or configure anything else. So here I just got to type in my password, connect. And so it actually reached out to Azure, authenticated me, and then these are the databases I have available on that server. So I've got two. I have a Dunder Mifflin this one's going to be used for the replication demo, and then the DMA is for this demo. So you'll notice here that my local database name is different than the database that I'm actually going to. So this is one of those things that if you have a requirement that you want to kind of modify database names, I'm not sure I would recommend it, but this tool will facilitate that. Transactional replication won't. So here I want to click next. And it kind of died. That's fantastic. Wow. All right. Well, let's try to get reconnected. Yep. Oh, I know why. Yep. So one of the things with Azure, let's see. Yeah. Okay. So what happened there is there is a service tier in Azure with Azure SQL Database that you can specify that you want the database to pause. It's called serverless. What's the beauty about serverless is that once the database has been paused, there's no connections. There's no, more importantly, there's no CPU cycles. So if you're not utilizing CPU or compute with that database, you don't get paid. You don't have to pay for it. So you can save money. It works great for like lower environments like dev. Like if you don't have anybody working on your databases over the weekend, it'll pause for the duration of the weekend. And the only thing you pay for is the storage, and storage is relatively cheap these days. So serverless is a great service tier for Azure SQL Database if you want to be able to try to save money. The downside is that trying to resume that database, it takes like 45 seconds sometimes for that database to kind of wake up. And that's what that was. That glitch was, it was actually SQL Server in Azure waking that database up. But here we can see it recognizes all the tables and schemas that I want from my local database, and I want to push all these up. I'm obviously not going to select the users because it's not going to migrate that. And what happens behind the scenes is it actually generates SQL scripts. And so this tool will actually go through all the schemas and all the objects in my database, generate the create statements for all those objects, and then we actually will deploy those objects up to Azure. And so right now that's what it's doing. And we can see it came back with the script. And so we have this long list. And so you can actually, if you wanted to, you can actually save this out. So you can actually save the script out and deploy it later if you wanted to, or do something else with it. So you got some flexibility here. In my case, I'm going to deploy the schema. And we can see on the right-hand side, it's actually taking that script and sending that command all the way up to Azure. Azure's processing it and then coming back and saying, yep, it's completed successfully. We can see that it did 128 commands and there were 0 errors. So now in my database in Azure, I have all the schema. And we can actually verify that. Move this over. So here up on the upper left, I have my 2 databases. This is the logical server that I'm connected to. Here are my Dunder Mifflin and my DMA databases. So if I expand that Dunder Mifflin DMA, we can see that I have objects in here. And if I right click this, come on. Come on, computer. Oh. I don't have any data. So I've got the schema, so the structure's there, but I don't have any data. So now I can go back to Data Migration Assistant, and right here on the bottom, I can click Migrate Data. And so now it's going to go and say, okay, what tables do you want to migrate? Yep, here are all the tables that I want to migrate, and it gives us a row count. So we can see that for the most part, these tables are small. It's not a lot of data. This order details table has 1.2 million rows. So again, depending on your internet connectivity to Microsoft Azure, your local processing speeds, what service tier Azure resources is in, will kind of dictate how fast this might go. Thankfully, if I click Start Data Migration, we can see I've got 13 tables to migrate. So I've got 13. Hasn't done anything yet, but I do have a small dashboard here to kind of quickly see how things are moving. And you can see that the smaller tables are already done. We've already got green checkboxes. This order details was at 1.2 million. So it's moving. It's at 25%. And this took about 45 seconds last time I checked. So that orders table is done. So right now it's only processing the orders details table. And pretty soon it should finish. And then we can verify that in our management studio or Azure Data Studio, depending on which one you want to use. And this is almost done. So remember, this is 1.2 billion rows. I know that sounds small, but that could be a lot of data that's pushing up to Azure. It does do things in parallel. So it'll actually take two tables at one time and send that data up. So it tries to maximize using parallelism and maximize your throughput when you're migrating, which is good. And this is almost done. It's at 99.3%. Come on. Just got to get over the finish line. Oh, it took longer than 45 seconds. So it took 1 minute and 16 seconds for it to finish. So now if we go back to Management Studio and run this again, voila, we have data. And so that's a really easy way to use the free tool to migrate your data up to Azure. And again, this tool will work for all the products. So you can use this tool for Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. It'll work, and it'll work nicely. So if you've got a small subset of data or databases that you can use this with, that might be a really good tool to fit your needs. So I've got about 12 minutes. So the other demo I have for you is dying is how you know it's a real demo. Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'm doing it live. The other demo I have is to show you how SQL Server replication works. So I actually scripted this out. And so I have a database in, come on. And see, this database right now is waking up. So it had paused from when I started it this morning and when I'm doing the demo now. And so right now, Microsoft is saying, hey, database, it's poking it, going, wake up. Really, technically, under the scenes, it actually has to attach that database to a compute node, but it has to wake that database up. And that's what this is taking so long, is that it's got to wake up before we can actually touch it and expand it and see what's in it. And we get an error because it's pausing, or it was paused. So if I expand this and it actually wakes up, we'll be able to see that there shouldn't be any objects in that database if I clean things up correctly when I got done building the demo. Oh, I've got objects. So I did not clean that database up. Well, we can do this. Oh, no, I can't. I got to clean that up. Let's see if this works. We're just going to delete this. My apologies. Like Dave said, you're doing it live when things do not go the way you expect. Delete, but we'll just delete these tables. Don't delete tables in production. That's bad. All right, so no objects. We don't have any objects in the database right now. So I'm going to set up replication real quick for my local laptop. And what's going to happen is, if you're not familiar with transactional replication, it's going to stand up what's called the publisher. I'm going to specify that publisher to be my local database, this database right down here on my local laptop, to be the publisher. And so when I make data changes to this database, it'll push those changes automatically up to Azure. It'll create 3 agent jobs. One will be a log reader. And so the way that transactional replication works is that there's actually a job that runs behind the scenes that just scans that transaction log that I mentioned earlier and says, ooh, has anything changed? If anything's changed, I need to capture it and send it somewhere. And then there's a snapshot agent, which actually says, give me a snapshot of what the data looks like right now. And they send that snapshot up to the subscriber or whoever is receiving that data. And the subscriber will make things look like what it looks like right now. And then there's also a distributor agent that will actually does the work of sending it to the subscriber. So, and we can see, if I scroll down here a little bit, I have a bunch of jobs, but I don't have anything that's related specifically to that Dunder Mifflin job. And when I create the replication, we'll actually see 3 new jobs show up that is specific to replicating that data from my local laptop up to Azure. So here's the script. I've already got it pre-configured. It's going to run. Should not take that long. And so right now it's setting up and configuring that publication and the subscription to basically link my laptop to Azure SQL database. And so that is the publisher subscriber methodology. And with moving to Azure SQL database, it has to be a push subscription. So Azure can't pull or query my laptop to say, give me all the new changes. You have to push them to me. And so that's the only way to move, to use transactional replication to move to Azure SQL database. So we saw that we do have 3 jobs. So if I refresh this, we see these 3 jobs show up. These 3 right here. These are the 3 jobs I was talking about: the log reader, the snapshot agent, the distributor. The other job I have to do, the command I have to do real quick is, I actually have to modify because of the way that my laptop is set up with my organization and whatnot. I have to adjust permissions. So basically what happened is, again, we took a snapshot of what the tables look like. And I selected 2 tables in the script, is the customer table and the employee table, I believe. And so replication took a snapshot of those 2 tables, sent that snapshot up to Azure. Azure recognized it and said, yep, we're going to create those tables and import all the data as it looks right now. And now then I've got a job that'll monitor for any changes. And if I make table modifications, if I change the data, it'll send that change up to Azure. So back into my Azure, again, no objects. But if I refresh this, if all worked, ta-da, we have data. So we see the 2 tables. If I right click this, so very easily with a simple script, and you can even do this to the UI, it just takes a little bit longer. That's why I didn't do it for the demonstration. I easily use transactional replication to push a database from my local laptop up to Microsoft Azure. Now, again, if I was moving terabytes, would I do it this way? Maybe, I don't know. It would depend. I'd want to test it. So those are the 2 demos I have. So we're going to go back to the slides. So moving to Azure seems daunting, but some of the tools and the methodologies, if we step through those methods and the options we have available, it can help mitigate some of that dauntingness, if you will, to make things easier. So let's talk about the steps real quick. Again, I walk into organizations that want to just rush. Never assume it'll just work. Things happen, hiccups happen. When we go to the cloud, we have to test it, and just don't assume that a method's going to work. Make sure we test everything. Assess as much as possible. Utilize the database migration assistant at least for the assessment. Take that tool and assess what you might have in your local databases that won't work in Azure. You might be surprised as to what might be in those databases, especially if you have a larger ecosystem in your local environment where you've got thousands of databases. You'd be surprised as to how often I find things that people didn't know existed within the database. Hey, did you know that it's not encrypted, or it is encrypted and that's going to be a problem, or you're using this feature and that feature doesn't work with Azure? You'd be surprised. So definitely use database migration assistant. I'm sorry, that's a typo. It should be data migration assistant. And then during your testing process, double check your assessments. Double check to make sure that things haven't slid in from a deployment somewhere that they've done in production. That also happens. So that's a thing. So double check your assessments during your testing phase. Oh, my clicker just does not want to work. Testing. Testing is something that most folks don't want to do. And testing is super critical, especially when we go to Azure or in really any cloud environment, because we're moving that data from your local data center into somebody else's data center that could be hundreds of miles away from everything else. So know our limits in terms of testing. If we don't have the right testers, or we don't know the right, if we're not experts in Azure or databases, then find the right people to get the right people involved to ensure that your testing is as thorough as possible. Test thoroughly as possible. And again, check outside your expertise if you're not an expert in that particular area. This is one of those areas where I totally support slowing down and asking for help. It's okay to ask for help. And this is one of those environments or the situations that I highly recommend that we stop and get the right people involved. I'm a DBA. I'm not a networking expert. I would want a networking expert to help me unwire that mess. So testing to me is like super critical when we migrate to Azure. We want to test the migration process. We also want to test the migration result in terms of performance and how the application handles. Don't just go to Azure thinking that's going to fix everything. Failure handling. What do we do when the migration fails? How do we handle that? If we have an outage, your internet connectivity drops, how do we facilitate that? Do we have to start over? If we're moving multi terabytes, what does that mean? Are we doing it online, offline? How do we handle that? Make sure we talk about that. Come on. Wow, my clicker. I wonder if my laptop is having issues. So testing will make or break the migration, and that's true in my opinion. Testing is one of the most critical pieces of any migration to the cloud, whether it's Azure, Google, whatever. Testing your migration is super important. So when we migrate, make sure we know all the steps. So document those steps and know what has to go and when. Know the timings. This is also super critical. I've been in migrations where the CEO is standing over my shoulder saying, how long is it going to be? Thankfully, we would do our testing and we had an idea. In theory, based off the testing, this volume of data should take X number of hours, seconds, days, weeks, months, whatever that might be, but at least know what that timing is. So keep track of those timings when you do the testing. Please, please, please. After the migration, double check your permissions. Make sure your data is secured. If I'm one of your customers, I don't want to find out that you did an Azure migration and your data is unsecured and we had a breach, and then we're going to have problems. So please, please double check your permissions and double check your encryption once you get to your cloud provider. Most cloud providers, kind of make it harder for you not to have encryption and permissions in place, but it still happens. So communicate effectively when we migrate. Make sure all the team members are on board. Watch for Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law likes to follow me around, and Murphy's Law is basically whatever could go wrong will go wrong. So Murphy's Law just likes to follow me around like a lost puppy. So watch out for Murphy's Law. In your testing, try to mitigate some of that Murphy's Law. Come on, clicker. It's almost done. I know I'm at time, but we're going to. Come on. As a data professional, roll back if necessary, roll forward if possible. Very few organizations today will roll back that migration. Usually we roll forward and try to just press on and fix any issues once we get there, and then we'll work. Murphy's Law, Dave says, Murphy's Law is why I carry a bat. And I do actually carry a small Louisville Slugger bat around. It's my fidget spinner. I actually spin it in my hand. But yeah, I carry it around. Roll forward if possible. It's probably easier, but know what we're going to do. Roll back if you need to. Roll forward if you can. It might make the migration easier. The day cometh. Ensure communication. It's like any other data move. We've done our testing. We know what we're doing. We have it all documented. We're going to expect bumps in the road. But then when we're done and we're done with that Azure migration to the cloud, celebrate, folks. that was supposed to like be a really nice timed thing. Celebrate. Make sure you celebrate the success when you get to the cloud and it's all done correctly and things are nice and neat. It's secured. Just make sure you celebrate. Quick summary. Make sure we answer the questions. Find out where your data is. How much do we have? Tina is my people. Tina carries a bat too. Actually, I have 2 bats in my office. Now that I think about it. Answer the questions. Evaluate all the options. Don't short change the options. Take a look at all of them. Think about making out that matrix to figure out the right option. Test thoroughly. Make sure we celebrate on success. I think my laptop is having issues with so much running, which is really strange because I've got like 8 cores and 32 gigs of memory on my laptop. And that's it. So I'm like 2 minutes over time. So any questions? I didn't see any in the chat. I don't know. Yep, always celebrate the good things. Tina is absolutely correct. None that I have seen. Hey, Josh. I used to work with Josh. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it, man. We'll have to. We should grab lunch. You have my email address now. Drop me a note. Well, we'll catch lunch as long as it's safe to do so. Let's put it that way. Cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. Again, my contact information is on the screen. You're welcome to drop me an email. I live and breathe SQL Server. Josh will probably tell you. I'm a diehard DBA. I love SQL. I do lots of things in the community. Like to answer questions, help people. So seriously, if you have questions or you need advice on something, drop me a note, send me a tweet, check out my blog, hook up with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to help. If I can't help, I'll point you in the right direction. But that's it. So enjoy the rest of the conference. I am speaking tomorrow as well on SQL Server indexes, the magic of indexes. Last session, I'm doing the first session of the conference, and I'm doing the last session of the conference. So I appreciate everybody coming and being here. And I think it's recorded, and I think everybody will have access to it. I'm not sure about that, but